Morning, everyone. Welcome back to our study of the Old Testament prophets. This is a class that was taught at Hastings First Presbyterian Church in the fall of 2025. But though it was an Advent class, it can really be taught at any time. You can do this recording at any time and hopefully be, blessed by it. Uh, I have an interest in the prophets primarily because they are the unknown heroes, really, of the Old Testament. I often refer to the prophetic literature as the flyover zone of the Bible itself. We in Nebraska live in the so-called geographical flyover zone where people move from or fly from New York to LA and they just kind of ignore us down here. Well, so with the prophets. But to ignore them is to really miss the opportunity to see how they influence particularly the identity and the life and the self-understanding and ministry of Jesus of Nazareth. So I thought we'd do this series of 4 or 5 weeks and introduce you to the books that you may not have read in your past. Last week we started with the prophet Amos, and we talked that time a little bit about misconceptions of prophets. We said that we often think of them as soothsayers, people telling the future, predicting the coming of a Messiah. And of course, they were that. They spoke about the hope for a Messiah throughout, several centuries of the life of the people of Israel or the people of Judah. When we picked up last time, the reason I mentioned those two distinguished Israel and Judah is because by 922 BCE, those were two kingdoms because of difficulties during King Solomon's reign. A king by the name of Jeroboam took the 10 tribes and established the nation of Israel, leaving two tribes in the south, the nation of Judah. And it was out of this context that we're really introduced to the prophets. At first, there was a prophet by the name of Ahijah who basically told Jeroboam, take these folks and go north. You can be your own king in Israel. But by the 8th century, we see what's known as the literary prophets. We had pre-literary prophets like Elijah and Elisha. You can add Ahijah to that as well. But by the 8th century, the late 8th century, the early 8th century, excuse me, 780, 760, we see the introduction of Amos. And Amos was a shepherd who was sent up to Israel to prophesy at the shrine at Bethel and in Samaria to let the people know that they're not following their responsibility to be the covenant community that they were called to be. This alternative consciousness of, being a community that worships God and recognizes the value of the neighbor as established in the Ten Commandments. The people of Israel were sorely falling away from that, primarily because there was affluence, there was wealth that was developing, and people were oppressing and manipulating and taking advantage of the poor. And God calls Amos into Israel to offer a message really of judgment. You're not doing what you're called to do. Now, remember the last time we said that a prophet does two things. They are called to criticize the dominant consciousness. This of course, Amos did quite well, right? If you read all 9 chapters of Amos, there's not much in the way of hope that's established. But the other thing that prophets are called to do is to energize the people who may have lost track of the original vision of the covenant community, and to give them a consciousness of hope. Draw upon the tradition that they have forgotten and let them know that they are called to be a, a light on a hill, you might say, a different strand of human being. You are called to be truly human by following God's law, because it's God's law that will instruct you on what it means to be just that, truly human. Now, when we talked last time about Amos, I think I mentioned to you the passage that is so well known that is actually inscribed on the wall outside of the Civil Rights Museum in Mobile, Alabama. Uh, God speaking through Amos to the people of Israel, talking about how far they have fallen away and how they take delight in all of these rituals around the shrine, and it's basically mindless, you know, posturing that's going on. But there's nothing of integrity to it. So I'll remind you of chapter 5. Chapter 5, verse 21. I despise your festivals. I take no delight in your solemn assemblies, says God. Even though you offer me your burnt offerings and grain offerings, I will not accept them. And offerings of the well being of your fatted animals, I won't look upon them. Take away from me the noise of your songs. I will not listen to the melody of your harps, but let justice roll down like waters and let righteousness like an ever flowing stream. Now, the reason I mention this is because this theme is going to be found throughout the prophetic literature. These two words, especially justice and righteousness. Righteousness is the condition that ensues when people follow faithfully covenant instruction as found in the, the Torah, the Ten Commandments, but also elaborated in the covenant code, you know, the explications of the Torah itself. A righteous person knows that true freedom comes in following the law of God. When a group of righteous people gather together in community, that community becomes one of justice, not retributive justice, as we said, not punishing justice. We often talk about, you know, criminal justice in our society, punishment, judgment, that kind of thing. But this is something that's referred to as distributive justice for egalitarianism and well-being, the presence of health. Shalom is present in the community. I think about that scene in uh, Exodus where the people are receiving manna from heaven, and it's almost a throwaway passage, but those who had much did not have too much, and those who had little of the manna did not have too little, but all were able to be, you know, fulfilled and filled by what God had provided. And that's the vision of a covenant community, where those who have much don't have too much, where those who have little do not have, you know, too little. But everything is taken care of, the need for food, the need for shelter, the need for, you know, faithful friendship. That's the image. And of course, Amos was reminding the people of Israel that the covenant community had fallen away from that ideal. Affluence had led to oppression, had led to a complete misunderstanding of who they were. And so the remainder of the prophet Amos, if you were to read to the end of chapter 9 in this book, you will see that it's filled with words of judgment. You know, God is going to punish you for falling away. All of these images of a God who is not happy with, you know, the state of affairs in Israel at the time. And so you might say, well, Dan, where's the message of hope in that? I thought you told us that prophets are supposed to criticize the dominant consciousness, which Amos surely does, right? But what about this message of hope you're talking about? Well, if you were to say that, you would have been listening to what we were talking about. And with Amos, we do not see that message of hope, except in the last 5 verses of the text, which is curious, right? Because if we look at the other prophets, we will see very clearly that they are balancing, you know, the criticism and energizing, you know, criticizing and energizing. They're balancing together judgment and hope. But when we read the last 5 verses, we get a sense that there's something that's not quite consistent with, you know, the tone of what has gone on before in Amos. And what scholars have discerned in this is that when you read the last 5 verses of Amos, you get a sense that there's an addition that has been made. And this is really important for us to understand because the prophetic literature or the literature of the Bible in general did not just simply fall out of heaven of a piece, right? It was written in a particular historical context. It was, passed on. It was edited, and it was edited over time, so that by roughly 400 BCE, the Old Testament, as we know it, had gone through a number of hands of learned scholars, scribes, priests who were trying to develop a tradition, an understanding that they could offer to the people as to who they were. And part of that understanding was that God, their God, was a God who was faithful, steadfast, and would not leave them. So, most likely, what happened is that an editor at some point added these last verses of hope in Amos to make it consistent with the rest of the prophetic literature that we know about. And it's an image that you are going to hear come up again and again if you are going to read the other prophetic literature. Um, I'll begin reading at verse 11. On that day, it's usually the introduction to the hopeful, aspect of the text. On that day, I will raise up the booth of David that has fallen and repair its breaches and raise up its ruins and rebuild it as in the days of old, in order that they may possess the land and the remnant of Edom. And all the nations who are called by my name, says the Lord who does this. The time is surely coming. Again, we'll see this trope added again in Isaiah. The time is surely coming, says the Lord, when the one who plows shall overtake the one who reaps, and the treader of grapes, the one who sows the seed. The mountains shall drip sweet wine, and all the hills shall flow with it. I will restore the fortunes of my people Israel, and they shall rebuild the ruined cities and inhabit them. They shall plant vineyards and drink their wine, and they shall make gardens and eat their fruit. I will plant them upon their land, and they shall never again be plucked up out of the land that I have given them, says the Lord. Pretty clear that the perspective of these 4 to 5 verses is one that comes after the fact of knowing what happens to the people of Israel. The people of Israel, the northern kingdom, were plucked up. They were eventually pulled out of their land by the Assyrians and taken who knows where. They were assimilated into other cultures. And this is what Amos may have been referring to, the judgment that was yet to come. So this is an introduction to a what we call a minor prophet. Amos prophesying to the people of the northern kingdom of Israel around 780 to 760 BCE, telling them they'd fallen away from their original calling to be God's people, and they were going to have to suffer the judgment of God for that. That judgment would eventually come to the people of Israel. Uh, there are, of course, in the prophetic literature, there is a division between prophets. There are a number of minor prophets, minor literary prophets like Amos and Hosea and Micah and Obadiah and on and on. But there are also major prophets. Major prophets are those who are whose literature, extends well beyond maybe 10 to 12 chapters. Prophets like Isaiah, prophets like Ezekiel, prophets like Jeremiah. Basically, there are 3 major prophets, and those are the ones that we're talking about here. Um, so we will move on now to talk about Isaiah. And Isaiah is a curious prophet because if you read his text, he's written more than any of the other prophets, especially all of the minor prophets, 65 chapters. And if you read those texts very carefully, you will see that the historical circumstances that he's referring to extend from roughly about 730 BCE all the way to about 500 BCE. So this raises an interesting question, doesn't it? Was this guy Isaiah, beyond all biological possibility, living 220, 230 years of life and prophesying during this time? Or are we looking instead at a what might be called a tradition that is associated with the name Isaiah? Isaiah is understood to be a priest who prophesied for that time period, but also had responsibilities in the temple, sacrificing to God, had a very different perspective on who God was, living in Jerusalem, abiding the temple cultic practices, very different from what we know Amos may have had, right? His whole paradigm for who God was going to be quite different. And he was going to be a person who was an advisor to the king. And so this Isaiah, let's call him that, really represents a tradition, a priestly tradition that has close association with the kings of Israel over a 250-year period of time. So that when we read Isaiah, we're seeing strands of literature. And scholars have broken these strands up into three sections. The first is called, very simply, First Isaiah, and it extends from chapters 1 to 39. Um, and it focuses on a time period that, centers around a very cataclysmic event that happens in 722 BCE. And then Second Isaiah extends from chapters 40 through 55, um, and was probably written in the midst of what was known as the Babylonian captivity. Eventually, Judah would be conquered by the Babylonians, and the people of Judah would be taken to Babylon. And there they would have to eke out some sort of existence that tried to maintain a continuity with their previous identity. And the people who were responsible for doing that were the priests, right? They were the ones that were going to keep them faithful. And Second Isaiah speaks to that particular time period. Third Isaiah is written just 11 chapters, chapters 56 or 10 chapters, 56 through 65, speaks to the time period in which the people return from Babylon to Jerusalem. Their temple is gone, their city is in ruins, and they are trying to energize themselves in hope to reestablish their identity as God's covenant community. So today, we're just going to simply look at First Isaiah, and not, of course, all 39 chapters, but we are going to look at the first several chapters with which you will much probably be familiar, especially as they are often called upon at the time of Advent. But before we do that, it's important to recognize that there is a historical context that we need to keep in mind. And all of this is actually alluded to in Amos. There is a rumbling of chaos that is happening to the north. Uh, if you look at this map here, you will see down here is the city of Jerusalem where Isaiah lives. Then, of course, here's Samaria, which is the capital of the northern kingdom of Israel, up to Damascus, a city that is still there today, Damascus, Syria. Then over here along in the Tigris-Euphrates River delta, on the Tigris River itself, is the city of Nineveh. And this is the city where the Assyrian threat is building. And the Assyrians were known as a ruthless civilization. They were militaristic. They moved into cities and they basically destroyed everything. And then those people who were not killed were taken up and moved to other places and basically assimilated into other cultures. So we would see this eventually happen to the people of Samaria. The 10 tribes of that area known as Israel would be either be killed or taken away in 722. But leading up to this, uh, Isaiah was called upon by the king of Judah at the time, a king by the name of Ahaz. And Ahaz saw the threat, the Assyrian threat building, and he wanted some counseling. He wanted Isaiah to come and tell him, what should we do? What should we do about these sabers that are rattling to the northeast, to the imminent invasion of this merciless army that's coming our way? And to add insult to injury here, there were some other machinations that were happening because the kings of Syria and Israel, King Pekah in Israel, then King Rezin in Damascus, Syria, they were conspiring with each other. They were creating an alliance that said, you know what, we can take on these Assyrians. We can certainly take these guys on. And all the better if we can get Jerusalem and the people of Judah to join us. And so, as Isaiah, the book of Isaiah opens up, we are in the midst of this kind of conflict. King Ahaz is looking for some sort of word of hope, looking for some sort of will that he can discern in these historical events. Isaiah, he says, should I join this alliance? And Isaiah says, no, you don't want to do that. And of course, Pekah and Rezin will try forcefully to get Judah to join, and that fails. But in the midst of this, it's chaos, a very tumultuous time. In the midst of this, Isaiah is called upon not to mete out judgment, right? Though that's part of his prophecy. But with every judgment that comes, there is a word of hope that is added to it. And as I said, we know that eventually the Assyrians, as these archaeological reliefs show, the Assyrians would come in to Samaria, would come to Damascus and destroy those nations, destroy those people. You can always tell in archaeological artifacts the Assyrians because they're wearing these little caps that look like Hershey's Kisses, you might say. But this is a memorialization of the overtaking of Syria and of Israel, taking the people away. You can see them carrying their what little possessions they could take with them, and being sent off to other lands where they would simply disappear. The so-called lost 10 tribes of Israel. So this is the context in which the book of Isaiah is going to open up. Remember the role of the prophet to criticize, but also to energize. We saw the criticism in great measure in Amos with very little energizing, but in Isaiah, all of that is going to change. In fact, it's probably with the Isaiah tradition that this idea of energizing for hope is going to have its firmest foothold. And Isaiah does open up in judgment against both the northern kingdom, but also of Judah itself. The northern kingdom is Israel, Judah in the south. And at the heart of any judgment is usually the idea that the people have fallen away from God's commands, fallen away from the Torah. And at the core of that is this idea that justice must prevail in the land that God has given to the people. Righteousness, these things must flow down like ever-flowing streams, says Amos. But I think it would be best for us to focus first, not so much on the judgment in Isaiah 1, but on a text in Isaiah chapter 2 that may be quite familiar with you. And the fact that this text appears word for word in another prophet, this time a minor prophet by the name of Micah, suggests that this was a kind of liturgy that was repeated and spoken and was well known in the southern kingdom. It was a vision that kept hope alive for the people. And I think you probably know it quite well, especially if you do anything around Advent season, anything involving the church. But notice how the message of hope opens as it did in Amos. In the days to come, in the future, and it won't be long. The future is always the place where we have our hope. In the days to come, says Isaiah, The mountain of the Lord's house shall be established as the highest of mountains, shall be raised above the hills. All the nations shall stream to it. Many people shall come to say, come, let us go up to the mountain of the Lord, to the house of the God of Jacob, that he may teach us his ways, that we may walk in his paths. For out of Zion shall go forth great instruction, and the word of the Lord from Jerusalem. He shall judge between nations, and shall arbitrate for many peoples. They shall beat their swords into plowshares, and their spears into pruning hooks. Nation shall not lift up a sword against nation, neither shall they learn war anymore. Actually, that image is added upon in Micah, where everyone shall sit each beneath his fig tree and enjoy the abundance of God. But this image of hope is what is going to keep people alive in the midst of this great chaos that we find around 722 BCE. And note when we read that, there's a kind of internationalization going on that we don't see so much in the previous literature, right? All of a sudden, Jerusalem is taking on an understanding of itself not as, a self-contained community, but as an image that can be appealed to by other nations, right? This is where we get the idea of the city on a hill. In the days to come, the mountain of the Lord shall be the highest, morally, the highest of the mountains, and the people of the world shall flock to it and say, teach us how to be true human beings. We see this Torah that you've been given, and we see your human character. Show us how to be that way because war is ravishing us. We want to beat our spears into pruning hooks. We want to beat our swords into plowshares. And you, people of Jerusalem, people of Judah, who have God in your presence, can teach us how to do just that. And this was going to be really what Isaiah was going to bequeath to the people of Judah in the midst of great chaos, this image of hope. There's the call of Isaiah, which is really interesting, which you should probably know about if you want to know anything about Isaiah, because it is really the foundation for one of the great Presbyterian hymns, at least. Holy, 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 Lord God of Almighty. Um, it comes from the prophet Isaiah, and it's the story of Isaiah's call. Remember, Isaiah was a priest. He worked in the temple daily. He was in charge of sacrificing to God, and he was perhaps one of the few people who could enter the so-called Holy of Holies, where the Ark of the Covenant was kept in the temple. At this time, the Ark of the Covenant was brought to the temple, and it was there that God was understood to be present and present most fully. And it's in the midst of this that Isaiah has this incredible experience. In the year that King Uzziah died, Uzziah, if I'm not mistaken, is Ahaz's father. I saw the Lord sitting in a throne high and lofty, and the hem of his robe filled the temple. Seraphs were in attendance, angels, above him. Each had six wings. With two they covered their faces, with two they covered their feet, and with two they flew. And one called to another and said, holy, holy, holy is the Lord of hosts. The whole earth is full of his glory. The pivots on the threshold shook at the voice of those who called, and the house filled with smoke. And I said, woe is me, I'm lost, for I'm a man of unclean lips, and I live among a people of unclean lips. There's the judgment. Yet my eyes have seen the King, the Lord of hosts. I'm an unclean person, yet my eyes have seen the King, and the result of that is going to be cleansing. Then one of the seraphs flew to me, holding a live coal that had been taken from the altar with a pair of tongs. The seraph touched my mouth, and with it, he touched my mouth with it and said, now that this has touched your lips, your guilt has departed and your sin is blotted out. Then I heard the voice of the Lord saying, whom shall I send, and who will go for us? And I said, here I am, send me. And he said, go and say to the people, and thus the prophecy follows. By the way, that is a trope that we hear throughout the Old Testament as well. God calls Abraham, and Abraham says, here I am. And God calls Samuel, and Samuel says, here I am. Here I am. My identity is in your presence, and I am transformed by your presence. Tell me where to go. Tell me what to do. Well, what Isaiah is going to do is to give hope to the king, Ahaz, who is trembling before not only the Assyrian threat, which is far away, but also before the threat of the Syrians and the Israelites, excuse me, the Sumerians, who are much more imminent, who are threatening to take him over. But Isaiah says to Ahaz, hold fast. God is with you. And Isaiah even says the most incredible thing, ask God for a sign, and God will give it to you. And Ahaz, to his credit, says, I'm not going to test God like that. That is that's tantamount to sinfulness. But Isaiah says, God wants you to give, to take this sign. And so I'm picking up with the reading at chapter 7 of Isaiah in verse 10. Again, the Lord spoke to Ahaz, saying, ask a sign of the Lord your God. Let it be deep as Sheol or as high as heaven. But Ahaz said, I will not ask, and I will not put the Lord to the test. Then Isaiah said, hear then, O house of David, you king, is it too little for you to weary mortals, that you weary my God also? You're causing trouble among your colleagues, mortals, but not only that, you're wearying God. You're refusing to do the thing that God is offering you. Therefore, I'm going to step in and do it for you, says Isaiah. The Lord himself will give you a sign. Look, the young woman is with child and shall bear a son and shall name him Emmanuel, which means God with us. He shall eat curds and honey by the time he knows how to refuse the evil and choose the good. For before the child knows how to refuse the evil and choose the good, the land before whose two kings you are now in dread will be deserted. By the time the child is 10 years old or so, Syria and Israel will have fallen to the Assyrians. The Lord will bring on you and your people and on your ancestral house such days as have not come since the day when Ephraim, Israel, departed from Judah, the divided kingdom. The king of Assyria is going to be that threat. Now, this is not exactly a perfect message of hope. There is going to be great chaos to come. But in the midst of that chaos, a seed will be planted. Literally, a child will be born. In fact, it's already about to happen because the young woman, that's all we know about her, is with child. And with that child is the hope of your nation. With that child is the righteousness and justice of God that you are called to represent to the world. Now, you probably have heard this in different language in the past. In fact, if you read the story as it's appealed to if you read the story in Luke or in Matthew, the reference is to a virgin. But in this text, the Hebrew text of the Revised Standard Version, we did not talk about a virgin. We talked about a young woman. Why is that? Well, remember, this text was being written in Hebrew. And in Hebrew, the term for young woman is alma, which basically means a woman who is of child-rearing age, a woman who is, fit to be married. Eventually, what would happen in the history of Israel is that the Greek conqueror Alexander would come to Jerusalem in 332 BCE. And there began a process of Hellenization. And it would not be long before the people of God were speaking Greek as well as Aramaic. And this is why our New Testament is written in Greek, because 300 years after that fact, the authors of the New Testament were writing in the lingua franca of the time. But in the speaking of Greek, there were scribes who got together and said, because we're speaking Greek so much, we really need to translate the Hebrew Bible into Greek because we're living in this Hellenized culture. We want our stories to be able to be told and read in the language we're now speaking. So when that translation took place, it was called the Septuagint. When the Septuagint was written, the translation for the word Alma in Hebrew became Parthenos in Greek. The word Parthenos in Greek carries with it a connotation of one who has not had intimacy with a man, a virgin. So when we read this text, informed by the Septuagint, the Greek version, we read, look, the virgin shall conceive and bear a child who will be called Emmanuel. And this is the text that the New Testament writers would have known and appealed to. So this is how the tradition of the virgin birth of Jesus arose in the New Testament. But it's important to realize that we're talking not about, when Isaiah is speaking, we're not talking about a virgin conceiving 700, 800 years down the road. We're talking about a young woman here and now is going to be this sign for you. A child is going to be born, and he will be a symbol of God with you. That child would be King Hezekiah, who was, recognized as one of the great kings of Israel, a faithful king who led his people through very tumultuous and chaotic times. But this becomes the hopeful image that interpreters of the life and ministry of Jesus would use to try to give people a sense of what it meant for Jesus to be the Messiah, the one anointed by God. Another image that we often read in Isaiah comes just a few verses after that, and it's one that you probably know quite well. But again, it's a sign of hope, the hope that comes with a child. It doesn't matter where you live in the world. You can live in India, you can live in the continent of Africa, you can live in the United States. There's always a special hope. There's always special wonder that comes with the birth of a child. Something new is about to begin. It's 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 imprinted into our DNA. And in the midst of this Assyrian threat, the birth of a child to King Ahaz is the hope that the people need. Something as simple as that. And so this righteous king coming to lead the people is spoken of in chapter 9, beginning in verse 2. The people who walked in darkness, the darkness that, the Assyrian army can certainly bring upon them. The people who walked in darkness have seen a great light. Those who lived in a land of deep darkness, on them light has shined. You have multiplied the nations, you have increased its joy. They rejoice before you as with joy at the harvest, as people exult when dividing plunder. For the yoke of their burden and the bar across their shoulders, the rod of their oppressor, you have broken as on the day of Midian. For all the boots of the trampling warriors that we saw, and all the garments rolled in blood shall be burned as fuel for the fire. War is going to cease, and every memory of it is going to go up in smoke. For a child has been born to us, a son given to us. Authority rests upon his shoulders, and he's named Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, Everlasting Father, Prince of Peace. His authority shall grow continually, and there shall be endless peace for the throne of David and his kingdom. He will establish and uphold it with justice and with righteousness. There we see those two words coming up again. He will uphold it with justice and with righteousness from this time forward and forevermore. This king will be, like Moses, one who establishes this covenant community where worship of God and the recognition of the value of each of God's people is recognized and affirmed. And this is the message of hope. Isaiah can be a great prophet for criticizing. He can criticize the dominant consciousness, but hope is ultimately what Isaiah is about. And he's going to be really the model of prophecy that is going to come after him. A prophet cannot be anything but one who criticizes, re- reminding people how they've fallen away, but more importantly, energizes, reminding people of how they are part of a covenant tradition that they need to uphold, that God will be with them in upholding that. So, with that, I'd like to ask you to consider a couple of questions for reflection in the time that you have remaining. We've been reading the prophet Amos and Isaiah with a historical critical method, using that as an interpretive tool, paying a special attention to how context influenced each of these men. Have you found this approach, historical critical approach, to be helpful to your understanding of God and to God's plan for salvation? Number two, have you read or heard the hopeful vision of Isaiah 2 and Micah 4? Have you heard that in your past? If so, in what context? What does this vision of God's peaceful kingdom mean for you today after understanding its historical context? How is it that our historical critical approach has perhaps informed the relevance of these passages for us today? Finally, Isaiah 7 suggests that the birth of a child will usher in a new era for the people of Judah. Reflect, if you will, on how children remain a symbol of hope for us today. Can you see why early interpreters of Jesus and his ministry found this to be a helpful and hopeful prophecy? So thank you for your time. I hope you've enjoyed this rather long introduction to Isaiah, but we will be with you next week when we will look at Jeremiah, the so-called weeping prophet. Till that time, I will see you much later. Bye for now.